was a cold morning in a quiet town when a young couple rushed to the hospital. The woman clutched her swollen belly, breathing heavily, while her husband held her trembling hand, whispering that everything would be okay. They had been waiting for this day for 9 long months. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. They had imagined the moment they would hold their little one for the first time, hear that first cry and see the tiny fingers wrap around theirs. But life had a different plan that morning, one that no one could have ever imagined. The labor was long, painful, and full of complications. The doctors and nurses moved quickly around the delivery room, their faces tight with focus. The woman screamed as waves of pain hit her again and again. Hours passed and her strength began to fade. The husband stood near her, wiping her sweat, whispering words of encouragement, even though his own heart was pounding in fear. All he wanted was to see their baby safe and healthy. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, the baby arrived. But the room that should have been filled with the sweet sound of a newborn's cry stayed silent. The husband froze. He waited for that tiny sound, just one cry to tell them their baby was alive. But the silence stretched longer and longer. The doctor's expression changed. One nurse quickly moved closer with medical tools. Another pressed a stethoscope to the baby's chest. The mother, though exhausted, looked up with tear-filled eyes, whispering, "Why isn't the baby crying?" No one answered right away. They all knew something wasn't right. After a few long, tense minutes, the doctor took a deep breath and looked at the couple. He spoke softly, but his words cut like glass. The baby had no heartbeat. The mother's face went pale. Her body went cold and her voice broke into painful sobs. The husband stood motionless, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. He looked at the tiny body lying still on the table, wrapped in a thin hospital cloth, and felt the world collapse around him. How could the life they had dreamed about vanish before it even began? The room was filled with sadness. The nurses lowered their heads, the doctor gently covered the baby, and the sound of the mother's cries echoed down the hallway. The husband held her, but he felt helpless. Nothing he said could comfort her. She kept repeating, "It can't be true. My baby can't be gone." But the doctor's face said everything. The baby was declared dead shortly after birth. Hours later, the mother lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling. Her body was weak, but her mind couldn't rest. She kept asking to see her baby one more time. The hospital staff brought the tiny bundle to her. She reached out with trembling hands and touched the baby's face. It was cold, she whispered softly, tears falling onto the small blanket. "You were supposed to cry. You were supposed to call me Mama." The husband stood beside her, his eyes red, trying to be strong, but tears ran down his face too. He kissed the baby's forehead and said nothing. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The hospital arranged for the baby to be taken to the morgue while paperwork was being completed. The husband followed the nurse down the hallway, his heart feeling heavier with every step. When he saw the small body being placed in the cold room, he broke down. He couldn't understand why this was happening to them. He had prayed for this child every single day. Now all that hope had turned into unbearable pain. The night felt endless. The couple didn't sleep. The mother kept holding her stomach, still feeling the emptiness inside. Every sound from the hospital hallway made her flinch, as if expecting someone to come in and tell her there had been a mistake, that her baby was alive. But no one came. The next morning, the hospital staff prepared the baby for the funeral. The family was informed. The grandmother cried uncontrollably. The grandfather tried to comfort her, and other relatives arrived with flowers, all dressed in grief. It was supposed to be a celebration of new life, but it had turned into a day of mourning. The small coffin arrived at the hospital later that morning. It was white, barely 2 feet long, with tiny golden handles on each side. The husband could barely look at it. His hands shook as he helped the nurse gently place the baby inside. The mother wasn't able to stand on her own, but she insisted on seeing everything. She wanted to be sure her child was handled with love, even in death. The nurse covered the baby with a soft cloth, tucking it in like a sleeping angel. Everyone in the room was quiet. The air felt heavy, filled with sorrow that words couldn't express. The family decided to hold the funeral that same afternoon. The husband carried the coffin carefully to the car while the mother sat in the back seat, holding the tiny white blanket that had once wrapped her baby. As the car moved slowly through the streets, people along the way stopped and watched. Some whispered prayers, some wiped tears. It was hard for anyone to believe that a life so new, so innocent could be gone before it even began. At home, relatives gathered in the living room where the coffin was placed on a small table covered with white flowers. Candles flickered beside it, their light reflecting off the baby's name written on a small card. The mother sat beside the coffin, her eyes fixed on it as if expecting it to move. She talked softly, telling the baby about all the dreams she had, how she had bought little clothes, painted the nursery, and imagined holding tiny hands. Her voice broke every few seconds. The husband sat beside her, silent, lost in his own thoughts. He had always believed he could fix any problem, but this time he couldn't do anything. Neighbors came to pay their respects. Some brought food, others brought words of comfort, but nothing helped. The mother's tears wouldn't stop. Every minute felt like another goodbye. The priest arrived to say a short prayer before they took the coffin to the cemetery. The mother wanted one last moment. She leaned over and kissed the lid gently. "Sleep well, my baby," she whispered. The husband placed his hand over hers, holding it tight, his throat dry, unable to speak. The sky outside had turned gray as the funeral car began to move again. The cemetery wasn't far, but the ride felt endless. Every turn of the wheels seemed to pull their hearts deeper into grief. At the cemetery gate, the family gathered around a small grave prepared near a row of blooming white lilies. The air was still. Only the sound of distant birds could be heard. The coffin was placed gently on a wooden stand. Everyone bowed their heads as the priest began to pray. The mother tried to stay strong, but her knees gave out and she fell into her husband's arms, crying uncontrollably. He held her close, whispering, "It's okay, love, it's okay," though he didn't believe it himself. As the ceremony continued, the mother asked to hold the coffin one more time. She wanted to touch it, to feel her baby close before letting go forever. The husband helped her lean forward. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, tracing the edges slowly. She whispered, "If only you could hear me. If only I could hear you cry once." Her words drifted in the air, lost between grief and silence. No one could have known that in just a short while, something unexplainable would happen. Something that would change everything they believed. The burial was scheduled for the next morning to allow relatives from another city to arrive. The coffin was taken back home for the night. The family placed it in the living room again, surrounded by candles and flowers. The mother refused to sleep. She sat near it, her hand resting on the lid, whispering lullabies. She told stories she had planned to tell her child one day, about kindness, about dreams, about love. The husband stayed beside her, his eyes red from tears but his heart still searching for answers. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment the doctor said there was no heartbeat. Something inside him still refused to believe it. Maybe it was denial or maybe it was hope. He didn't know. All he knew was that something didn't feel right. The night grew darker and everyone else in the house had gone to rest. Only the couple remained awake. The mother leaned her head against the coffin and closed her eyes, still humming softly. The husband sat nearby, lost in thought. The room was silent except for the quiet flicker of candles. He looked at the small coffin and felt a strange chill. He tried to shake off the feeling, blaming exhaustion. But something about that silence felt different, almost alive. He looked at his wife, asleep in tears beside the coffin, and sighed deeply. Tomorrow they would have to say goodbye forever. Or so they thought. The morning came slowly, with gray light creeping through the curtains. The small house was quiet except for the low sound of the clock ticking on the wall. The mother hadn't slept the whole night. She sat near the little white coffin, her eyes red and her body weak. Her husband walked in softly, carrying a cup of tea, though he knew she wouldn't drink it. He placed it near her and sat down beside her without saying anything. There were no words left that could make sense of what had happened. The candles that had burned through the night were now short, their wax melted on the table. The air smelled of flowers and candle smoke. Relatives began to arrive again, their faces tired and swollen from crying. They spoke in hushed tones, arranging the final things before the funeral. The husband tried to stay strong, greeting people, answering questions, and signing the last of the papers from the hospital. But his heart felt hollow. Every time he looked at that tiny coffin, something inside him ached in a way he couldn't describe. The mother sat in silence. Sometimes she would whisper softly, as if talking to the baby inside. "It's time to go, my little one," she said quietly, her hand resting on the lid. "You're going somewhere peaceful now." Her voice trembled, but she tried to smile through her tears. It was a smile full of love, the kind only a mother could give. Outside, the sky was cloudy again. A gentle wind blew through the trees, shaking a few leaves loose. The husband looked out the window and thought how strange it was that the world looked the same when their whole life had changed forever. He turned to his wife and said softly, "It's time." She nodded weakly. They carried the small coffin to the car again, this time followed by a long line of family members and friends. No one spoke. The sound of footsteps on the pavement and the soft crying of the mother filled the air. The husband opened the car door carefully, as if afraid even the smallest movement might disturb the baby's peaceful rest. The drive to the church was short, but every second felt heavy. The mother stared at the coffin the entire way, her lips moving in silent prayers. She couldn't stop thinking about how unfair life could be. She had done everything right during her pregnancy, every checkup, every medicine, every healthy meal. She had dreamed about holding her child, hearing tiny laughter in the house, and now all she had was silence. When they reached the church, people were already waiting. The priest stood near the entrance, his eyes kind and filled with sympathy. He greeted them gently and guided everyone inside. The coffin was placed on a small table near the altar. Candles surrounded it, their flames flickering softly as if bowing in respect. The mother and father sat in the front row, holding hands tightly. The priest began to speak, his voice calm and comforting. He talked about life, faith, and how sometimes miracles happen in ways we cannot understand. The mother closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks as she listened. Her husband squeezed her hand, both of them clinging to each other as if afraid to let go. After the prayer, people came forward one by one to pay their last respects. Some placed flowers on the coffin, others whispered words of goodbye. The mother didn't move. She just kept looking at the small white box that held her world. Time seemed to stop. When everyone had finished, the priest gently told them it was time to close the coffin. The mother's breathing quickened. She wasn't ready. She wanted just a few more minutes, a few more seconds even. The husband turned to the priest and nodded, giving her that time. He walked up to the coffin, touching the lid softly, and whispered something only he could hear. Then he stepped back, his eyes wet but steady. The mother slowly stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she moved forward. She reached out and touched the small coffin one last time. Her fingers trembled as she traced the smooth surface. "My baby," she whispered. "You were here for such a short time, but you'll always live in my heart." Her voice broke and she pressed her lips to the coffin, closing her eyes. The priest lifted his hand to signal the closing. The room grew silent. Everyone bowed their heads. And then, something happened. A faint sound cut through the silence. It was so soft that at first no one was sure if they had really heard it. The priest paused. The mother froze, her lips parted. Another sound followed, a weak, muffled cry. For a second, everyone just stared, their minds unable to process what they were hearing. Then the cry came again, louder this time, unmistakable. The mother gasped and rushed forward, pulling at the coffin lid. The husband moved quickly beside her, his heart pounding. When they lifted it open, the sight before them made everyone in the room gasp. The baby was moving. Tiny hands twitched. Lips quivered. A weak, fragile cry filled the church, echoing against the walls. The mother screamed, not in fear but in shock and disbelief. She picked up the baby, trembling, holding it close to her chest. "He's alive!"
"He's alive!"
she cried, tears pouring down her face. The husband stood frozen for a moment before rushing to her side. He touched the baby's face, feeling the warmth return under his fingers. The child let out another cry, stronger this time. People in the church began to cry and shout. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, others fell to their knees, thanking God. The priest stepped back, his eyes wide. He whispered, "It's a miracle." The mother held her baby tightly, her heart racing, afraid to let go. She could feel the small heartbeat against her chest, steady, real, alive. The husband quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the baby to keep it warm. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. A few people ran outside, pulling out their phones, their hands shaking. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The mother didn't move. She just rocked back and forth, whispering, it's okay, you're safe now." When the paramedics arrived, they rushed to her side. The mother hesitated to hand the baby over, afraid it would stop breathing again, but the doctor gently assured her, They checked the baby's pulse and heartbeat. It was faint but steady. "He's alive," the doctor said, his voice full of awe. The crowd outside began to cheer and cry at the same time. Some said they had never witnessed anything like it in their lives. The paramedics carried the baby to the ambulance and the mother followed, refusing to let go of the tiny hand that clutched her finger. The husband climbed in beside them, his mind spinning. Just hours ago, they were preparing for a burial. Now they were rushing back to the hospital with a living baby. He looked at his wife, who was still crying but smiling through every tear. For the first time in days, she had hope in her eyes. The drive back to the hospital was tense. The baby's breathing was weak, and the doctor kept checking the monitors, adjusting the oxygen. The mother couldn't stop looking at her child. Every small breath, every sound felt like the most precious thing in the world. The husband sat beside her, whispering prayers under his breath. He didn't care how or why it had happened, only that it had. When they reached the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting. They quickly moved the baby into an emergency room. The mother tried to follow, but the staff asked her to wait outside. She stood near the door, clutching the small blanket the baby had been wrapped in. Her heart pounded as she listened to the sounds inside. The quick footsteps, the beeping machines, the voices giving instructions. Minutes felt like hours. The husband put his arm around her shoulders, but she couldn't stop shaking. Every second she waited felt like holding her breath underwater. Then finally, one of the nurses stepped out. Her face was tired but smiling. "Your baby is breathing on his own," she said softly. "He's alive. You can see him soon." The mother covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her knees giving way as relief washed over her. The husband caught her and held her close. They didn't speak. There were no words big enough for what they felt at that moment. The nurse went back inside and they both just stood there, holding on to each other, crying and laughing at the same time. In that moment, everything changed. What had started as a day of grief had turned into a miracle. The story of a baby who was declared dead but came back to life would soon spread beyond the hospital walls. But for now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that somewhere inside that room, a tiny heartbeat had started again, and with it, the world of two broken parents had come back to life. The hallway outside the hospital room was silent, but the mother's heart wasn't. It raced faster than ever as she waited to see her baby again. Her hands shook slightly, clutching the thin hospital blanket that had been wrapped around him earlier. Her husband stood beside her, his face pale but eyes filled with hope. Neither of them spoke. They just stood there, lost between disbelief and gratitude, afraid to blink as if the moment might disappear if they looked away. After what felt like forever, a nurse stepped out from the room. She smiled softly and gestured for them to come inside. "He's stable now," she said gently. The mother's breath caught in her throat. She followed quickly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. When she entered the room, her eyes went straight to the small incubator in the corner. There he was, their baby, breathing on his own, tiny chest rising and falling, his skin warm and pink again. The mother's eyes filled with tears instantly. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stop herself from crying out loud. The husband moved closer, his step slow, his eyes wide. The baby's hand twitched slightly, and that one small movement felt like the greatest miracle in the world. The nurse explained softly, "He's very weak, but he's alive. We'll need to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. It's rare, but sometimes newborns can fall into a deep state that mimics death, almost like their body pauses for a while. We don't always understand why it happens." The mother listened, but her focus never left her baby. Her heart overflowed with emotions she couldn't put into words. She whispered quietly, "You came back to me." The father placed his hand gently on the glass of the incubator. He had seen many things in life, but nothing had ever made him feel so small and thankful at the same time. He remembered how cold the coffin had felt in his hands just hours earlier, how heavy the air had been at the church, and now he was watching his son breathe again. It felt unreal. News began to spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses who weren't even on shift came by to see the baby everyone was talking about. Some smiled with tears in their eyes, calling it a miracle. Others whispered prayers quietly near the doorway. One of the older doctors who had originally declared the baby dead came in, visibly shaken. He looked at the tiny child through the glass and said softly, "In all my years of medicine, I've never seen anything like this." The mother sat in a chair beside the incubator, refusing to move. Every few minutes she leaned forward to whisper something softly to her baby, small words of love and comfort. The husband brought her water and a blanket, but she barely noticed. She just wanted to stay close. She watched every breath, every little movement, terrified that if she blinked too long it might stop. Hours passed and the baby grew stronger. The nurses checked his heartbeat and each time they smiled. "It's steady," one of them said. "He's fighting hard." The mother smiled too, wiping her tears. She whispered, "You're strong, just like I knew you'd be." As evening came, the doctor returned to give them an update. "He's doing well," he said gently. "We'll keep him in observation for now, but it's a good sign. You should rest too. You've both been through a lot." But resting was impossible. The couple stayed at the hospital that night, unable to leave their baby's side. The father sat quietly, staring at the small incubator. He couldn't stop replaying everything in his mind. The funeral, the crying, the chaos, the ambulance sirens. It all felt like a strange dream he couldn't wake from. He looked at his wife and said softly, "If that cry hadn't come at that exact moment." He stopped, his throat tightening. She looked at him and nodded. "I know," she whispered. "He was meant to live. That's the only answer." Late that night, when the hospital grew quiet, the mother finally leaned her head on the side of the incubator and whispered a lullaby. Her voice was low and shaky but full of love. The baby's tiny face twitched, almost as if recognizing the sound. She smiled through tears. That small reaction felt like the world's biggest gift. By morning, the story had already reached local reporters. The hospital phones wouldn't stop ringing. Everyone wanted to know about the baby who came back to life. But the parents didn't care about interviews or attention. All they wanted was for their child to recover fully. Doctors continued to monitor the baby for the next few days. Slowly, his condition improved. He began to cry louder, move more, and open his eyes. The first time he opened them, the mother gasped. She leaned closer, whispering, "You're really here." The baby blinked slowly as if looking right at her. The father watched, his eyes shining, and whispered, "Welcome back, little one." The hospital staff called it one of the most extraordinary cases they had ever seen. One nurse said quietly, "It's as if he refused to leave this world." The mother agreed. "He came back because of love," she said softly. "Maybe he heard us calling." A week later, the baby was strong enough to be moved out of intensive care. The couple was finally allowed to hold him properly for the first time. The nurse gently handed the baby to the mother, and the moment his small body rested in her arms, she broke down crying again. But this time, they were tears of pure happiness. She kissed his forehead over and over, whispering, "You scared us, but you came back. You really came back." The father wrapped his arms around both of them. He couldn't stop smiling. "We're never letting you go again," he said quietly. The nurse smiled at them and said, "You're holding a miracle." In the following days, people from their neighborhood visited the hospital to see the family. Some brought flowers, others brought food. Everyone had the same question. How did it happen? The couple didn't have an answer. They just said it was a miracle. The priest who had led the funeral came to see them too. He looked at the baby in the mother's arms and shook his head with tears in his eyes. "I've seen faith shaken," he said softly, "but this renews it." He placed his hand gently on the baby's blanket and whispered a blessing. The mother and father thanked him, their hearts full. When the baby was finally discharged, the doctors gave a few instructions. "He'll need regular checkups," one doctor said, "but he's perfectly healthy now." The mother smiled and nodded. She couldn't stop looking at him. Every tiny sound he made was precious. Every little stretch, every yawn, every blink felt like a treasure she didn't deserve but had been given anyway. The drive home was different this time. The last time they had made that drive, the car was filled with silence and sorrow. This time it was filled with the gentle sound of their baby's breathing. The mother looked down at him in her arms and smiled through tears. "You changed everything," she whispered. When they reached home, the family was waiting at the door. The grandmother burst into tears the moment she saw the baby. "He's alive!" she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. She kissed his tiny hands again and again. The grandfather stood behind her, wiping his eyes. "We buried our sorrow," he said quietly, "and brought home a miracle." The neighbors came out to greet them, clapping and cheering. Some had watched the ambulance rush by days earlier and had prayed for the family. Now they smiled and said it was proof that hope should never be lost. The mother felt overwhelmed but deeply grateful. She held the baby tighter and whispered softly, "You're everyone's miracle now." That night, for the first time in days, the couple slept peacefully. The baby slept in his crib beside them, his breathing steady and calm. The mother woke up once in the middle of the night and sat up quickly, her heart jumping, a habit formed from the fear of losing him again. But when she saw him sleeping peacefully, she smiled and brushed his cheek gently. "You're safe now," she whispered. The husband woke too and reached out to touch her hand. "We got our second chance," he said softly. She nodded, looking at the baby. "And we'll never take it for granted," she replied. Outside, the moonlight poured into the room, casting a soft glow on the crib. The tiny baby stirred a little, making a small sound before falling back asleep. The mother watched him for a long time, her heart full of love and quiet awe. She thought about the strange way life worked, how quickly everything could change, how close they had come to losing him forever, and how a single cry had brought them all back to life. That night, the house that had once been filled with sorrow was filled with peace, and for the first time since that cold morning at the hospital, the sound of gentle breathing, the most ordinary sound in the world, felt like the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Days turned into weeks, and the small house that had once been filled with tears was now full of laughter, warmth, and the sound of a baby's soft cries. Every corner of the home seemed alive again. The mother often sat near the window holding her baby close, still unable to believe that he was really there with her. Sometimes she would just stare at him for minutes, tracing the little lines on his fingers, watching the way his tiny chest rose and fell. Each breath reminded her that he was alive, that somehow he had fought his way back from the edge of death. The father spent most of his time close to them. He had always been a quiet man, but since that day, something in him had changed. He smiled more, spoke gently, and often found himself thanking life for giving them a second chance. Every morning, before leaving for work, he would lean over the crib, kiss the baby's forehead, and whisper, "You're our miracle." Don't forget that. Neighbors still stopped by from time to time, some out of curiosity, some out of kindness. Everyone had heard about what happened. The story had spread far beyond their small town. People came to see the baby who had come back to life, as many called him. Some brought small gifts, others brought tears and stories of how the event had touched them. But the parents tried to keep their life simple, not letting the attention change them. For them, it wasn't about fame or stories. It was about love. Pure, fragile, and precious love that had survived the impossible. The hospital staff continued to check on the baby for the first few months. The doctor who had seen him first came to visit once. He stood quietly in the living room, watching the child sleep peacefully in his mother's arms. "I still can't explain it," he said softly. "I've gone over the reports again and again, but there's no medical reason for it. Maybe it's something beyond science." The mother smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe it's something we're not meant to explain." The doctor nodded, almost in agreement, and said, "Sometimes life doesn't follow rules. It just surprises us." Every night when the house grew quiet, the mother would sit by the crib watching the baby sleep. She couldn't stop herself from checking his breathing again and again. Sometimes in the middle of the night she would wake up suddenly, panic for a second, and lean over to listen to his soft breaths. Each time she heard that sound, she would smile and whisper, "You're still here. Thank you." The father often woke up to find her like that and would gently pull her close, whispering, "He's fine. He's strong." But deep down he understood. The fear of losing their child again had carved itself into their hearts forever. One afternoon, as the mother rocked her baby in her arms, she remembered the moment at the church. The sound of that first cry. It still echoed in her mind. She had replayed it thousands of times, each time feeling the same mix of shock and relief. "That cry brought us back to life," she said softly to her husband one day. "Before that moment, everything inside me felt dead. And when I heard him cry, it was like I could breathe again." The husband looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "It's strange," he said, "how a sound so small can change everything." As the months passed, their baby grew stronger. His cheeks filled out, his laughter filled the house, and his eyes followed every movement his parents made. He was full of life, always smiling, always curious. Every little thing he did felt like a miracle. When he rolled over for the first time, the mother cried. When he said his first word, the father laughed so loudly the neighbors could hear. Their life, once marked by sorrow, had become a collection of joyful moments. Yet there were times when the weight of what had happened still hit them unexpectedly. Sometimes the mother would be folding baby clothes and suddenly freeze, remembering the small white coffin. Other times she would catch a faint scent of flowers, the kind that had been at the funeral, and tears would fill her eyes. The memories were painful, but they also reminded her of how far they had come. She often told herself, "We lived through that darkness so we could understand the light." The family became closer than ever. The grandparents adored the baby. The grandmother often said, "He's not just our grandson, he's proof that love is stronger than death." The grandfather spent hours telling people in the neighborhood about the miracle, his eyes glowing with pride. The baby had become a symbol of hope for everyone who knew their story. People said that whenever they felt hopeless, they thought about that little baby and found courage again. One evening, the couple took their baby for a walk in the park. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. The air was cool, and the sound of children playing filled the distance. The mother looked at her baby, who was wide-eyed, looking at everything with wonder. "He loves the sunset," she said with a smile. The father nodded. "He loves life," he replied. They walked in silence for a while, just soaking in the moment. They passed by the small church where it had all happened, the same place where they had once stood with broken hearts. The sight of it made them stop. The mother held her baby closer, feeling a wave of emotions rush over her. "This is where it all changed," she whispered. The father stood quietly beside her, remembering every detail of that day, the silence, the cry, the chaos, the joy. "Yes," he said softly. "This is where we got our miracle." They both stood there for a moment, the wind brushing against their faces, before continuing their walk. That night, back at home, the couple sat together after putting the baby to sleep. The room was dimly lit, the sound of crickets coming from outside. The father looked thoughtful. "You know," he said slowly, "sometimes I think about how close we were to burying him. Just a few more minutes and it would have been too late." The mother looked down, her eyes glistening. "I know," she whispered. "But maybe we were meant to hear that cry. Maybe it was destiny." The father smiled faintly. "Destiny or miracle, whatever it was, I'll never stop being thankful." He took her hand and held it tightly. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, just feeling the quiet peace that filled the room. As time went on, the baby's story continued to spread. Local newspapers wrote about it, calling it the miracle cry. People from nearby towns sent letters, some sharing how the story had restored their faith, others simply wishing the family happiness. The couple read every letter, often crying as they did. It amazed them how one small life could touch so many hearts. But through all the attention, they stayed humble. They didn't want fame. They just wanted a quiet life to raise their child in love. The mother often said, "Miracles are meant to be lived, not displayed." One day, the doctor who had treated the baby at the hospital visited again. He came to check on the child's health, but he also wanted to see how the family was doing. When he saw the baby laughing in his mother's arms, he smiled warmly. "He looks perfect," he said. "Healthy and strong." The mother smiled back. "He's full of surprises," she said. The doctor nodded. "He's proof that sometimes we have to believe in what we can't explain." Before leaving, the doctor looked at the couple and said, "You know, in medicine, we call this a near-death event. But in life, I think you'd call it something else." The father asked, "What would you call it?" The doctor paused for a moment, then smiled. "A second chance." After he left, the mother stood by the window watching the baby play on the floor with his toys. The sunlight fell gently across his face, making his skin glow. She smiled and whispered, "A second chance. Yes, that's what it is." She turned to her husband, who was watching them from the kitchen doorway, and said softly, "We'll never waste it." That night, when the baby finally fell asleep, the mother leaned over his crib and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "You've taught us more about life than anyone ever could," she whispered. "You've shown us that miracles don't come with warnings. They come when we've lost all hope." She stood there for a long time, listening to his quiet breathing, the same sound that had once vanished and then returned like a gift from heaven. Her husband came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her. "He's our heartbeat," he said softly. She nodded. And he always will be. Outside, the stars shone brightly, scattered across the sky. The world was calm again, but their hearts were forever changed. In the silence of that peaceful night, the couple finally felt what they had been longing for. Not just relief, but deep, lasting gratitude. They knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new worries, and new joys, but they also knew one thing with certainty. Life had given them a miracle, and they would spend every day cherishing it. Years had passed since that unbelievable day, yet the memory remained as clear as sunlight breaking through clouds. The baby who had once been pronounced dead was now a bright, lively child who filled every room with laughter. His eyes shone with the kind of light that made people pause and smile. He had a way of looking at the world, curious, innocent, and full of wonder, as if he somehow understood how precious every moment was. The parents often found themselves just watching him, still amazed by the gift they had been given. They had gone from planning a funeral to celebrating birthdays, from tears of sorrow to tears of joy. Every small milestone felt like a victory. His first steps, his first word, his first laugh. They would often look at each other and silently remember what could have been if that miracle hadn't happened. Their home had become a warm place filled with the sound of little feet running across the floor, toys scattered everywhere, and the smell of homemade meals. Life had changed completely, but one thing never faded: the feeling of gratitude that lived inside them. They no longer took anything for granted. Even ordinary days felt special. The mother still kept the small white blanket that once wrapped her baby on that dreadful day. She had washed it and folded it neatly in a box, keeping it as a reminder of how fragile life could be. Sometimes she would take it out, run her fingers over the soft fabric, and whisper a quiet thank you to the heavens. The father, too, kept the tiny hospital tag that had once marked their child as deceased. It stayed tucked inside his wallet, not as a painful memory, but as proof of the miracle that changed everything. The people in their town never forgot the story. It had touched everyone in one way or another. Even strangers would stop them in the market, smiling and saying, "Is this the miracle boy?" The mother would smile politely, nodding as she held her son's hand. Some would say, "You're so lucky," but she always replied gently, "It's not luck, it's life reminding us that hope is real." One day, when their child was around 5 years old, he came home from school with a small drawing in his hand. It showed a family standing under a big yellow sun, all smiling. In the middle was a smaller figure, him. "Look," he said proudly, "this is us." The mother's eyes filled with tears as she knelt down to hug him. She looked at that picture and thought about how once, not long ago, she thought she'd never get to see her child grow up. Sometimes the father would sit on the porch in the evenings watching his son play in the yard. The child's laughter echoed through the air, mixing with the sound of birds returning home. The father often thought about how fragile that laughter could have been, how close they had come to never hearing it. "Life is strange," he said once to his wife as they watched their son chasing butterflies. "It takes you to the edge just to show you how strong love can be." She nodded, smiling softly. Maybe that's what miracles are, reminders that love never gives up. Their child grew up healthy and happy, full of questions about the world. But there was something gentle about him, something different. He was kind to everyone, always offering to help, always curious about people's feelings. The parents sometimes joked that maybe deep inside, he remembered that second chance he had been given.